G'day, it's Jamie, and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today, I'm reading an old newspaper article about a bunyip and giant snake story from the Tweed River in 1895. So we'll get into it. This was published in Sydney's Sunday Times on Sunday, the 5th of May, 1895, titled Tales of Australian Serpent Life by Matavai, a startling adventure. I sat upon a block of wood by the doorway. Surgeon B paced up and down in the flickering firelight. Both were smoking. My mind misgives me that I have made you a foolish promise. Looking backwards, I find old memories stir within me with a force which I had thought long deadened by time. But when a gentleman makes a promise, he is bound in honour to redeem it. Hero Surgeon B drew himself up in a stately manner. You are aware, continued he, that I possess some knowledge of botany. Some few years ago, a brother officer of my acquaintance wrote me from England begging me to obtain him some specimens of Australian orchids. He also enclosed the draft for a handsome sum of money wherewith to cover all expenditure. His request chimed in with my own inclinations to a nicety, as I was then seriously thinking of starting to explore the far-stretching scrubs which then lined the banks of the Tweed River. When I reached the Tweed, I was so fortunate as to fall in with some gang of cedar cutters who had come down the river for supplies. They agreed not only to carry me and my belongings up to their camp, but also to place the boat and the services of an Aboriginal guide at my disposal, while I should remain. Their camp was situated in a beautiful spot near the water's edge, not far from where the township of Coogin now stands, and I soon made myself at home. I was not charmed with the Aboriginal guide. First impressions always go a long way with me, and though the fellow was tall, well built, and active as a panther, he had but one eye and was diabolically ugly. However, he made out that he was delighted to enter my service, and as he was credited with being handy about a camp and a boat, a skilful hunter, and intimately acquainted with the forest recesses from one end of the river to the other, I put the ugliness out of mind and decided to keep him. But I confess, I never took too kindly to Jackie. A lowering scowl of feature seemed habitual with him, and at odd times I detected a fierce gleam in his single eye, which betokened a vengeful and treacherous nature at bottom. The first few weeks passed away pleasantly enough, but as you all know about that sort of life as well as I do, there's no need to make a long story about it. I had succeeded in getting together a splendid collection of orchids, some of them very rare, and one or two quite unknown species. When there came a spell of heavy rain, and we were all forced to remain in the camp for a week. While that weather lasted, I saw a good deal of both the bright and dark sides of cedar getters. Life as it was in those days, and I also picked up a good many queer old yarns. Of course, some of them were pretty tall, but there was one yarn which excited my curiosity, both as a botanist and a naturalist, and it pretty much ran as follows. Once upon a time, 2 or 3 of the party took it into their heads to explore the largest of the beautiful islands which, as you remember, lie about 6 miles higher up the stream. They were strongly urged by some Aborigines not to go. The devil is there, long a big fella swamp, they said, and Moreover, the scrub was tenanted by a monster snake, which, in their excited imaginations, they declared to be as large as a good-sized tree. The cedar cutters were so familiar with the superstitious fears of the Aborigines that they took no notice of their warnings and started for the island, which, owing to one trifling cause and another, they did not reach until late in the day. During the few hours of daylight which remained to them, they discovered a track through the swamp and the most beautiful flowering tree, which they all agreed was well worth the trip. They saw nothing of the big snake and returned to the landing place with the intention of camping there for the night and continuing their exploration on the next day. However, some hours after nightfall, the party had been so disturbed and alarmed by a succession of uncouth and hideous cries which sounded in the direction of the swamp, that they took to the boat and, as dark as it was, pulled down to the main camp. Nothing would induce them to return. I made up my mind that I would visit the island, if it were only to see the wonderful flowering trees of which I had been told. I did not expect that Jackie would consent to help me pull the heavy boat, but, to my agreeable surprise, he made no bother about it, but only stipulated for the performance of two things. First, he was to receive a bottle of rum immediately on his return. Secondly, I was to promise to quit the island before sundown. I agreed to both conditions and we started. I had received some directions from the cedar party, and when we had pulled up about halfway along the north side of the island, we landed at a spot where 3 conspicuous tamarind trees grew near the bank. Beneath the shade of their broad leaves, we sat down and shared some bread and meat. In consideration of Jackie's exhortations at the oar, I unthinkingly and very foolishly, as it afterwards turned out, displayed a flask of brandy, a small supply of which I always kept in camp, and gave him a stiff nip. No sooner had he swallowed it than he asked me for more, which I good-humouredly refused. But he continued to pester me to that degree that he spoilt my smoke and my temper, and I roared at him in vigorous Anglo-Saxon. The fellow's manner changed immediately. With a glance of bitter malice, he called me an ugly name and said, "S'pose you no give 'em, me take 'em." And with that he made for the boat, which I had stored the flask away in the pocket of my mackintosh. Without another word, I hit out and knocked him head first off the bank into the river. Puffing and snorting, he rose in a minute, looked me steadily in the eyes, and then, with swift and powerful strokes, swam across to the little islet opposite. Half amused and half angry, but attaching no sort of importance to Jackie's behaviour, and without thinking of the flask, I shouldered my rifle, turned my head southwest, and headed for the swamp. An hour's toilsome walk through the virgin forest, impeded by a clustering undergrowth of lawyer vines and stinging bushes, brought me to the edge of a large circular swamp, covered by an apparently impervious growth of reeds, flags and rushes, fully 10 feet high, over or beyond which it was impossible to see from the ground. So I shimmied up a strong liana until I caught sight of the flowering trees, which, strange to say, grew fair in the middle of the swamp, and, taking its bearing, I then bore round to the right until, sure enough, I came upon the entrance of the narrow track described by the cedar getters. The slight elevation which the track ran seemed to me to have been formed by the continued accumulation of driftwood brought to that spot by old-time floods, and it zigzagged about in every direction. On either side of me, high above my head, rose the dense jungle of reeds which sprang from the putrid and sweltering mud. Now and then I caught sight of a shy water hen, but there was no sign of any other opening than the one I was in. All at once I turned an angle and emerged upon a tiny strip of coarse watergrass, perhaps 5 feet in width, which lay between me and the mouldering trunk of a gigantic flooded gum which had either been overthrown or swept there by flood. Flush with the far side of the log lay the dark waters of the deep lagoon, of about 4 acres in extent, surrounded everywhere except on this side by the impenetrable hedge of reeds. Upon a small hillock of vegetable mound, which covered the huge root and butt of the fallen trunk, stood the graceful but rather bushy flowering tree of which I was in search. At first glance I saw that the men had been deceived as to the nature of what they called its bloom. In reality there was not a flower upon it. What they took to be the bloom was caused by the brilliant colouring of every alternative leaf, the gorgeous tints of which varied from peach blossom pink, orange and scarlet to the loveliest damask rose. These colours, contrasting with bright green, altogether formed one of the most beautiful sights I had ever beheld. How the tree came to be there is, and always will be, a mystery to me. There is but one species of it known to botanists all over the world, and it flourishes only in South Africa. From where I stood, I made a careful sketch of the tree, and then climbed about halfway up and began to pluck and to press the choicest of the tinted leaves. You know what an intense and solemn silence creeps over these tropical forests after midday, although you are surrounded by a forest world teeming with 1,000,000 diverse forms of animal, insect and vegetable life, among which the struggle for existence is fought out with a stubbornness and savagery not exceeded in the human condition. Yet from the hour of noon until 3, scarcely a sound will break the brooding stillness, and hardly a token of animate life will be visible. So it was on this hot day. Every leaf hung motionless under the blazing hot sunshine. Nothing stirred but the wings of a few degenerate butterflies, and that often felt, but always mournful fancy, that I was the only living thing in all this wilderness of trees was beginning to steal over me, and my attention was attracted by the slight rustling motion among the reed tops at the end of the strip of turf. Drowsily and with half-shut eyes, I looked down, but there was nothing to be seen. And as I was beginning to think of something else, when, out of a small burrow-like opening in the face of the reeds, there came stealing out the head and forepart of an enormous serpent. It stretched out until it reached the water's edge, and then began to drink. And although not more than half of its body was in view, I estimated its length to be fully 26 or 28 feet, and its thickness as about equal to the mat of a man's leg. Here was another mystery. The huge snake was a constrictor of the largest size, and evidently belonged to the species Lias childreni, frequently met with in North Australia, and there much dreaded by the Aborigines. But how in the name of wonder did it happen that one should be found in this latitude? I was fairly puzzled. It was possible to believe that the seed germ of the African tree goosey might have been carried by a bird, but there was no accounting for the presence of the monstrous serpent. I was nervous. I confess freely that I was very nervous. I have always felt the strongest repugnance to the society of snakes of any kind, and the sight of this dangerous reptile, lying as it were right at my feet, stirred my bile and warned me it was time to look for my rifle. I had left it leaning against the shaded side of the tree, and I got off my perch and was about to step onto a lower limb when, as if struck with paralysis, I arrested my foot in mid-air and stared fixatedly downwards, and well I might. Round the angle of the reeds, which hid the mouth of the track, a sinewy hand, grasping a keenly edged tomahawk, was resting on spongy soil. Presently another hand was brought forward, and then a shaggy black head poked out cautiously, and the next moment the upturned glare of Jackie's bloodshot eye fell upon my blanched face. A pause, during which I could hear the beating of my heart, and then the stark naked body of the Aborigine shot out of the covert, and in another moment he was brandishing my loaded Winchester above his head with an exulting yell. My imagination never could have conceived such a picture of triumphant ferocity as he presented. His chest heaved, and his strong limbs quivered with passion. His malignant features were distorted by the working of a devilish glee, and around his brawny shoulders was strapped the leather pouch containing my brandy flask. When I saw that, I at once knew from whence he had drawn the courage which had prompted him to attack a man of my such reputed muscular strength as myself. I know also my hour had come. I turned my face away and offered up a fervent prayer to the Omnipotent that I might be spared a lingering death. When the Aborigine had seized my rifle, he had stepped backwards a few paces until he was within a step or two from the brink of the pool, and with a clear view of me and his back to the sun, he began. "Hi, Moggum, you old devil, you hear me speak. You think self budgero fine fella, eh? Strong fella, eh? 'Cause you been knock on poor black fella? Yah, grr. Me no like 'em, you this long time. Go, me look out. Kill old devil Moggum 2-3 week ago. Only me fraid, her. Me no pretend this time. My word. Me shoot you long a back and break 'em. Then me throw you in water hole all this life longer, devil. Yah. Old Moggum, you see this?" As he finished speaking, he took the flask from its pouch and put it to its lips, and was in the act of throwing his head back when a dull yellow streak flashed along the green turf, and before I could obey an involuntary impulse to shout to Jackie, the wretched boaster was caught and entangled among the mighty coils of the serpent. He uttered a succession of the most agonising screams, and in another moment the writhing bodies of both man and serpent toppled over into the pool and disappeared. The whole scene had been enacted with such a startling rapidity that I almost imagined that I had been dreaming, but the streams of blood-coloured bubbles which flecked the surface of the agitated water too truly to betokened the nature of the horrible tragedy which was taking place in the depths of that haunted pool. What surprised me the most was that as the struggle was prolonged, the swirling and the surging of the water showed that it grew more and more violent. How was it possible that, unable to breathe, and held as in a vice by the folds and teeth of the monstrous serpent, that Jackie was enabled to make such a desperate fight? As if to answer my question, his head and shoulders rose to the surface. An awful sight. I hope I may never see such another. The flesh had been literally stripped from his face and throat. His eye was bulged out of its socket, and his jaws were wide open. For one moment the lifeless carcass floated before me, then it sank, and I saw it no more. But what had become of the serpent? How was it that the violent agitation of the water still continued? a tremendous splashing near the other side of the lagoon suddenly informed me that a large, dark body, clothed with fur like platypus, had risen from the depths, and then I found out what had become of the serpent. Several of its coils were entwined around the forepart of the strange animal, which appeared to be so vigorously resent the intrusion within its watery province, and judging from its motions, I inferred that the constrictor was flurried and anxious to escape. Every now and then it would uncoil a length or two and stretch out along the surface of the pool as if in an attempt to swim away. Then it would as suddenly dart back again in rapid folds with convulsive energy and wildly snap with its teeth at every part of the animal within reach. But the bodies of the combatants so rose and fell, so twisted and whirled about in the foaming water, that it was with great difficulty that I could make out the form of the animal. I made out, however, that its head resembled that of a boar pig. Its jaws were protuberant and powerful, and between its muscular forearms it held fast part of the tail end of the serpent, which it was rending with its teeth. I could not see its eyes, which were concealed by a shaggy overhanging fur, but there was no difficulty in judging its vocal powers. All the time it remained above the water, it continued to snarl and growl in tones which like that grunting roar of an enraged pig. And once, when the serpent must have bitten it in some vulnerable part, it uttered a deep voiced rumbling roar of amazing volume and ferocity that awoke the echoes far and near. Although this description takes up some time, the Bunyip, if Bunyip is what it was, remained in view but for a few moments, and when it last roared, sank almost instantly, dragging the reluctant and enfeebled serpent alone with it. But I had seen enough. My nerves were greatly unstrung by the exciting events of the morning, and I had been much shocked and by the revolting spectacle of Jackie's death. During the occupations and excitement of my stay on the island, I had been unconscious to the flight of time, and I now woke up to the fact that not only was it late in the afternoon, but also the weather had rapidly changed for the worst. Heavy masses of black thunderclouds obscured the sun, and as I hurried through the reeds and re-entered the sombre forest, the moan of the wind warned me that a tropical thunderstorm was close at hand. Although I was homeward bound, my depression of spirit was so much increased by the dismal gloom of the scrub and by the ominous silence which prevailed, that I felt rather relieved when the storm burst in sudden fury and the branches began to snap in all directions. Wet through and dispirited, I hurried along and reached the brink of the river. The boat was gone. At that very instant, my ear caught the sound of the booming roar of the Bunyip, away back in the scrub. Was I deceived, or was it possible it was following me? With straining intensity, I listened to every sound, and this time my ears could not be mistaken. The roar was repeated, and I knew then that the dreaded beast was on my track. Here was a predicament to be in. There I was, unable to swim a stroke, and without a weapon of any kind, with a deep river on one side, a savage and mysterious animal on the other, and nightfall drawing rapidly near. With nervous haste, I climbed out upon the horizontal bow of a water gum, which overhang the river about 6 feet above the water, until I reached its extremity, where, holding on to another limb above me, I thought I would be beyond the reach of the Bunyip. But just then the brute gave another savage roar so close to me that I was almost at my wits' end from fear, and casting my eyes wildly about, I noticed a pine log drifting straight in front of my line of my feet. In a moment, I was swinging by my hands from the lower bow. The log was almost under me when I again heard the roar of the Bunyip not many yards away. In my terror, I dropped awkwardly. My heels struck the log, and it turned just in time to meet the back of my head. I was stunned and remembered nothing more until I woke to consciousness in the cedar party's boat. They told me that having seen the boat drifting down with the tide from the hill where they were at work, one of the party had swum out and brought her in, and together they had set out in search of me and Jackie. Just as they turned the end of the island, they had caught sight of my upturned face as supported by the wide pine boards of the pressing pad which was strapped around my shoulders. I floated insensible with the current. Naturally, they were very inquisitive to know the circumstances which had brought me into such a predicament. In order to divert any suspicions that I had killed Jackie, with the relation of my adventures in due order might have suggested to the minds of these half-wild borderers. I told them that Jackie had watched his opportunity to steal my flask of brandy and then my rifle, and that probably in order to escape being followed, he had turned the boat adrift. The end. Well, I like that story. That's really interesting. Okay, that's it for me. I'll get back to you all next time. Bye.